dogs.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Great.
Yep.
I can't see it, but do you have a puppy now?
There, do you see it?
Oh,
Oh, it's
whose is that?
6 pounds.
Whose is it?
Mine
Oh, really?
from the SPCA. Yes.
Good for you.
I adopted him. I thought the world is going crazy, so I'm going to join them.
So instead of ducking 2 dogs when you come over to visit me at the church, I have to duck 3.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, he's so cute, Barb.
Yes, he is.
He's adorable.
Amazing company. So yes.
What's his name?
Cannon? And that was his name by the owner, who had to give him up because she was going to a retirement community with no animals. And it was a name for a friend of hers who had the name, and I changed it to Canon, which is musical. So yeah, it's just Cannon, but it's music.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, whatever, honey, right?
All right. Well, why don't we go ahead and get started?
Yeah.
So the Lord's Prayer. What are people's earliest memories of having to recite the Lord's Prayer?
Elementary school.
Elementary school. Okay.
Yeah, started in elementary school.
Okay.
Preschool.
My mother taught it to me when I was little.
Yes, me too.
I think my grandmother taught it.
Okay.
It was what my grandmother taught me, and I remember lying in bed snuggled up to her and her going over and over and over each line to try to remember it with her. I just remember that so clearly.
Hmm.
So it was probably 2nd grade, 3rd grade.
Yeah.
For those of you who just jumped on, I just asked the question, what were folks' earliest memory of the Lord's Prayer?
I don't remember.
Now, Bill, you said you recall reciting it in school?
Yeah, well, back in the 50s and late 40s, you were allowed to recite prayers in school. That was before the Supreme Court decision, whatever it was, that stopped it.
Did you go to school in Pennsylvania?
No, Washington, D.C.
Actually, I think we had to do it in New Jersey too, and in Pennsylvania.
Yeah, we did it, and I remember the neighboring school district, Abington Township. That's a case was lodged there for not saying the prayer in school. And I remember when we did it. I remember when we stopped doing it, which would have been, late 50s.
So was it we'll do the Pledge of Allegiance and then we'll do the Lord's Prayer kind of thing?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah, I think
And we
so,
actually
too.
had a Bible. We actually had a Bible reading too. This
Right.
is public
Okay.
school.
Too.
Yeah.
Yeah, you did too, right?
Mm-hmm.
No, I remember in Michigan, we absolutely never said the Lord's Prayer in school. It was just the Pledge of Allegiance.
So I've heard some, well, I'm not going to assume that was a bad feeling, but I've heard some really moving feelings of, having a mentor kind of work through it for you. I mean, when you think of the Lord's Prayer, what do you think of? I mean, what kind of comes to mind? What feelings?
Comfort.
Comfort. Okay.
And I think it's a reverence, like really, the hallowed be thy name is real special. I think it's, sort of a reverent way to speak to God.
Okay.
I thought of the Our Father as, being a child of God. It's peaceful. Somebody's going to take care of me when I was a little kid.
Okay.
Nice. And my father died when I was 2, so that whole idea of a father it's like it's not there for me.
Mhm.
So Lord is better.
Okay. We're gonna, as we study it, we're gonna kind of break it down to its components, and so it'll be interesting to kind of hear of our own personal life reflections and how that kind of informs how we hear these words, and we'll be comparing it to how the early church heard those words. What else?
Todd, it's coming to mind that I forget which Jewish authority said this, but he was ordering us kids not to recite the Lord's Prayer, and he said incorrectly, when they say Our Father, they mean Jesus Christ, and that was why we weren't supposed to say it.
Okay.
I never had a problem saying the Lord's Prayer because to me the Lord was God. You know, it's fine to talk to God.
Right.
Right. Yeah, and oddly enough, there is no Trinitarian understanding in it.
Mhm.
It's okay.
I am going to have to do a separate class for all the animals, aren't I?
For what?
For all the animals.
Mhm.
Right. Mark just got home and he's eating dinner and this dog wants his food, so please
Uh-huh.
excuse that.
Where did I say it? I see the nose. Well, this animal here.
So for our session this evening, I just want to kind of introduce the Lord's Prayer, explore what a couple of the early church leaders thought about the prayer, and look at some different versions that the earliest church might have used. And then next week, we're going to start breaking it down through its different sections. And I'm going to, on Sunday, I'm going to have copies of what is called our, it's a catechism that we use for people who are being confirmed in the church today. So it's a study catechism. And as part of it, there's a little breakdown on what the Lord's Prayer says as well. So you'll have copies of that. So we'll compare what ancient Christians believed about the Lord's Prayer. We'll compare it to how we interpret it today. And then we'll just talk about how when we recite it, what is it we're thinking? And hopefully there's a connection to all of those. But as we get started, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So I do in this study, I do want to focus on how the earliest church viewed it and how we view it. And I want to see what similarities there might be, as well as what differences that there might be. And Barb's Murray already shared with me some information about what it may have looked like in Aramaic. But if you have different versions of the Lord's Prayer, even though they might technically be authorized versions of the Lord's Prayer, but if you have other versions of the Lord's Prayer that as we're studying this and you want to share it with the group, that would be great. All right, so one of the earliest bishops of renown. So Cyprian is a bishop in Carthage. Carthage is a city in North Africa where we're really the church. I know a lot of people talk about like Rome being the center of the church in the West, but actually North Africa has many leaders of stature: Augustine, Cyprian, Tertullian, Origen. So a lot of what we hear and know from who we call the church fathers frequently comes from North Africa, and Cyprian is one of them. And in the 3rd century, this is how he describes the importance of the Lord's Prayer. What praying to the Father can be more truthful than that which was delivered to us by the Son, who is the truth, out of his own words, so that to pray otherwise than he taught is not ignorance alone, but sin. So for Cyprian, he saw the Lord's Prayer as being an essential gift, and that if we're going to be faithful, shouldn't we be using that prayer that Jesus offered to us as an example of how to pray? And if we don't use it, isn't it then a sin of not utilizing a prayer that the Lord has shared with us? So Cyprian's not only talking about the importance of what's in the prayer, but the prayer itself. Now, I'm not quite sure, we in the modern church would ever go to the extent of saying if we didn't say the Lord's Prayer on a regular basis, it's a sin. But think about what Cyprian is saying. If we want to pray to God, why aren't we using the words that Christ offered to us?
Well, I have a question. Why can't you use those words and then other words too?
I didn't say you couldn't. Neither does Cyprian.
Okay.
But to start in a life of prayer, it begins with the Lord's Prayer.
I have a question. So this prayer would have been recorded in all the Gospels?
We're going to get to that.
Oh, okay.
So let's look at another person's understanding of the Lord's Prayer. Now, Aquinas, who comes later, but gives rise to what we call the scholasticism in the church, says that in the Lord's Prayer, one not only asks for those things that ought to be desired, but also does so in the order in which they ought to be desired. Why are you laughing, Joyce?
I think that's a good one. I mean, that's really important. The first thing we're doing is being reverent to God. We're not asking for stuff.
And when we and again, here's the danger whenever we begin to take things apart. But as we take the prayer apart, line by line or phrase by phrase, we'll begin to see how they build on one another. And that while there's an importance to each of them, each of the different sentences or phrases, as they build on each other, they take on even a greater emphasis. And so, for Aquinas, he's noticing that, but he's noticing that it has a logical progression that goes through it. And in that progression, it's telling us what should be most important in our lives. And then also, what are the things that we can pray for and ask for and desire from God? So, Janet, to your question of, is it okay to pray about other things as well? Absolutely. And it's more of, you could almost cater or create your prayer life based upon a formula that the Lord's Prayer could create for you. And you could pray it in that regard. So Mark had the question of, what are the different versions? So in how many places does the Lord's Prayer appear in the Gospels?
Twice.
Just twice?
Yeah, Matthew and Luke, you've got it up there.
Well, right, but that doesn't mean those are the only places, right?
I believe they're the only places.
So why wouldn't it have appeared in Mark or John?
Hmm.
Good question.
No one wants to even hazard a guess?
No, it's a good question, Todd. We're all thinking.
I'll be honest with you, I don't have an answer.
Yeah.
That's not fair.
Well, of course it is. I mean, I asked you why you thought it wasn't in Mark or John.
You reminding when these were.
Yeah, remind us again which came first, second, third,
Yeah,
fourth.
when were
Oh,
they?
for crying out loud. How many more times do I have to go through this?
Many, many times.
So Mark is the earliest, around 60 or 70. Matthew is second, around 90. Luke follows that, maybe 95, 100. John's probably 100, 110.
So it's not the time sequence.
No, I mean, it's more, to me, it's more to do with Matthew and Luke spend a lot of time in terms of telling theological stories. And it has, and where is the Lord's Prayer offered up in, let's look at Matthew first. Where do we find it?
Sermon on the Mount.
It's on the Sermon on the Mount. And what's the corresponding sermon in Luke? We rarely talk about it, but here's the easy way to think about it. What's the opposite of a mountain?
It's a Sermon on the Plain.
It's Sermon on the Plain. So now the Sermon on the Plain is much shorter, but it contains the Lord's Prayer. So if it appears in Matthew and Luke, and this is Lynn's favorite gospel, even though nobody knows what it is, what is the source that it might have come from?
Oh, yeah. It's just
The Q source.
yeah,
The
the
Q
Q source, right.
Okay, so somewhere there is the common language found in most likely the Q source. And Matthew and Luke, the authors of Matthew and Luke, were aware of the Q source and used that source in addition to the Gospel of Mark, and then in addition to whatever other stories they knew of, to create their versions of the Gospel.
And of course, the Didache is earlier than any of them, right?
Didache is probably around the same time as Matthew.
Okay.
But what's in the Didache may predate the Gospels.
Okay.
In other words, the traditions that are then written up in the Didache could predate the Gospels. Yes.
So do you think John just chose that it was not important to include in his visions?
Well, John may not have been aware of the Q source.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So if
Right.
John's not aware of the Q source, and while he may have known about Mark and maybe Matthew and Luke, if he doesn't know that there's another source, maybe he just didn't feel the need to write about it.
Yeah.
So as you look at these three, so first let's look at the difference between Matthew and Luke. What do you notice?
Well, the length.
Okay, the length. So why is Matthew's longer, just in general?
Because he adds, "For thine is the kingdom."
Right. You have the doxology.
Yeah, that's all the earth stuff too, doesn't it?
Well, I think you're not. Oh, yeah, you are.
On earth as it is in heaven. Where's that? It's not there, is it? Oh, it is. Okay.
Yeah, it is.
Just the last
Mhm.
line. For thine is the kingdom.
Well, Luke leaves out "for thine is the kingdom," which is questionable anyway, right? Some versions of Matthew don't have it.
Correct.
Yeah, what's interesting when you talk about John not having it, if John was based upon the Apostle John, Jesus told this to his disciples. You know, they heard it probably more than once, probably many times. So it's interesting just from that standpoint that John doesn't have it in there.
Well, but then
Based upon either John the apostle didn't write John, probably not because of the year, I don't know. But the stories that were sent down from person to person didn't include it.
well, that could explain John, but then what would explain Mark?
I don't know.
Because we all assume that if Mark, well, if we're going to go with the urban legend of who wrote Mark, it was supposedly a follower of Peter. So why would a follower of Peter not have the Lord's Prayer? And I'm just,
Right.
you know, that those are just the questions of why it appears in one area and it doesn't appear in others.
Mhm.
You know, so we know that one of most of the major words appear in Matthew and Luke, except for the doxology. A little different language. You know, Matthew, our Father who art in heaven. Luke, Father, hallowed be your name is the beginning. But then let's compare the Didache's version to those two.
Well, lead us not into trial is a difference, right?
Right?
Deliver us from the evil one.
What else?
That's a shortened doxology.
As a shortened doxology.
Mhm.
And do we have debts or do we have trespasses?
That's
Yeah.
the Didache. D and the D.
But could that just be a language from a slightly different group?
And how are you meaning that?
Well,
Later.
Well, the translators of King James
yeah.
might have mistranslated.
Yeah, I'm thinking either originally that one area would have used something that would be, I mean, debtors is narrower than trespass.
Is it?
And well, I would put debtors under trespasses. I wouldn't put trespasses under debtors.
What's the debt we're talking about?
Taxes,
Huh?
prayer,
Prayers or debt. Is it?
And we're going to talk about this in more detail, but I mean, trespasses is what? Maybe something we've done wrong to others?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Well,
Who do we owe a debt to?
well, we could say we owe a debt to God because
That's correct. So is debt larger or smaller than trespasses?
larger.
Larger.
So the use of debt, and we'll talk about this in more detail, probably signifies that the earliest church, because the Didache is as you know, Mark sort of alluded to, it's a compendium of behaviors, practices, liturgies that the earliest Christians were using to guide their lives. And it's probably evident from the very beginning that the church realizes that the greatest purpose for Christ in entering the world is for atonement. And atonement deals with debt. Now, yes.
what I'm curious about if Cyprian felt that it was sinful not to use this prayer and use other words instead, what would he think of the two gospel writers who didn't include it for their followers to even learn in the first place? They would have been saying other prayers, wouldn't they?
Well, so there's the difference between, Cyprian is writing at a time that, let's say, so he's writing 3rd century. So for the most part, we have a general understanding of the 4 gospels.
Yeah.
What you're arguing over in terms of canon would be Paul's letters and the other letters. So his argument would not be with the other gospel writers. His argument would be with those people who are, whether they're following the dictates of Christ in 2 of the gospels or not.
Okay.
So who comes up with the idea of atonement?
The earliest Christians.
Okay.
But it's put into its greatest form by St. Anselm. St. Anselm writes on it in the Latin, I think it's Homo Deus, which is, human God. And it talks about the need of why God came and had to be human. So fully God and fully human. So he finally puts it into kind of how we would look at it theologically. But the earliest church believed in a more judaical atonement. It's not something that gets created later.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So as you're seeing these in front of you, these different versions, and does it, what are you feeling, thinking?
Well, they're all alike, so can we say that they came from a common source?
Yeah. I don't think anybody doubts that.
Okay.
I mean, I guess the question I'm asking is, when we begin to pull this apart, how are you feeling?
I feel for me, the essence of each one is the same.
Okay.
The essence that I get from it. Except maybe, for the word debt and trespasses, I always read trespasses as powerful as debt. So.
Didn't want to jump to that yet.
No.
Anything you want to note now that you want to talk about later?
So similar.
We'll probably get into this, but I mean, I learned Matthew's version.
Right.
As a Lutheran, I learned Matthew's version. And I know when I went to my fellow Catholic friends' church, they didn't have the doxology at the end.
Right.
I think that was the only difference, as I remember. Then I get to, I'm going to a Presbyterian church, and now I'm dead in debtors. To me, it's just interesting as to why each different denomination picked which version that they want to give.
Yeah.
It's not a denominational decision.
Okay.
So, first of all, why do the Catholics not have the doxology? Well, part of it is because something that Bill has mentioned. The doxology in Matthew is not universal in terms of the Gospels of Matthew. Okay, so if you just want to go back to the biblical standards, and most of the versions, at least in Scripture, Luke and Matthew, neither would contain the doxology.
Hmm.
But since it does appear in some of the versions of Matthew, and it does appear in a slightly different version in the Didache, which was the teaching guidebook for the earliest church, there are some who chose to believe that the doxology is appropriate.
Hmm.
Mhm.
Now, the difference of trespasses and debt, debt is frequently used in the West. The Western churches in general use the word debt. It's changed more recently, but if you were to compare the versions used in the Western Church versus the Eastern Church, since the Western Church became more tied to the atonement theory, debt was always the prevalent one. In the East, you might see something that's trespasses.
Yeah, Todd, it's important to point out we're looking at English translations of the Greek. It could be in all three versions of Greek, it's the same word that is just being translated differently, right?
Yes, but it's also what you when you're translating things, you not only are looking at the word, but you're also looking at context.
Mhm.
So what are the other words around it? And how is it used during a time frame? So, I mean, most versions, at least in the better translations, usually stick with debt. But it is interesting. But we'll get to that in a little more detail as well as we study it.
Using that different word means, sort of relearning, because I learned with trespasses, and that's really what when I say it to myself, that's what I say. But then the debtors is like a surprise.
I think trespasses became, and I would have to research this more, but just from how I know theology kind of changed and softened, I would think that trespasses may have become prevalent, particularly in um, the American church context in the 18th, 19th century. Because I think in general they were moving away from, you had an influence of liberal Protestantism, which became sort of in the States, sort of the way to go, and probably wanted to lessen the idea of the atonement and debt. So, but I would have to research that more.
I guess to acknowledge that you are a debtor is like sort of more serious than, trespasses is a little wishy-washy, but
True.
it's sort of putting you on the line there.
Right.
Yeah, I get a feeling with trespasses, it's like you own something and somebody is coming over that line of the things that you own. It seems more material to me in some respects.
Well, it's a shift of meaning, because if you're a debtor, that means you owe,
Mhm,
and if you're trespassed against, or
mhm.
you've just sort of it seems almost more about you being owed something.
Right.
Trespass, I think, can be thought of as almost intrude upon. So
Yeah.
you could intrude upon somebody's property, but you can intrude upon that person too.
Right.
Um,
Pat, go ahead.
You did.
She's muted, yeah. Is this your stuff? She can't get the bone, can she?
Hey.
I just got a text from Ruth Santana Grace. There's a fire at Overbrook Presbyterian Church.
no.
Please keep that community in your prayers.
Oh my.
Wow.
I was just switching to see
Mm.
if there's anything on Inquire, but nothing yet. So how do you think the Lord's Prayer was used in the earliest church?
Well, the Jewish families had, I mean, and Bill, you can correct me on this. My understanding is they said prayers like before meals, before going to bed, they got up in the morning. I mean, prayer was a very integral part of their life, of doing it several times a day. And so I would assume that they integrated this prayer into the ones that they were already doing
Yeah,
for those who were of Jewish background.
this prayer is not in the Old Testament, so I don't think the Jews would pray it at all.
Okay.
No, I meant the Jews who converted, who became Christian, who followed Jesus. Let me put it that way. The Jews who followed Jesus would integrate this prayer into those prayers that they had been taught to pray as observant Jews.
So what prayers are Jews supposed to pray? Bill, don't answer.
Well, you've got the prayer at the beginning of Shabbat meals, which I think is, I always thought in the household that was Jewish and Christian that I lived in for a long time, that when we said that, it was before the meal and it was the beginning of the Sabbath. And I don't know all the other times that prayer was said, like during the day.
My understanding is when they got up in the morning, they would say a prayer. Before they ate, they would say a prayer.
I think in the morning, that's what I've heard you say.
What about at night before they fall asleep?
And what prayer was that they would say in the morning and at
Shema.
Shema?
Mm-hmm.
Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. So that's going to start off your prayer. So there are regular prayers in the Jewish world that you would now be partnering with that. You would partner the prayer that Jesus taught.
Mm-hmm.
So we have recordings listed. So Pliny the Younger, and I love these ancient names. Pliny the Younger is a governor who his principality, the place that he governed, was in a region of northern Asia Minor, so modern day Turkey, on the coast of the Black Sea. And so he writes in the 1st century that Christians use this prayer in worship.
Mm-hmm.
For those of us who were in the Didache study, it calls upon Christians to pray 3 times daily, including the Lord's Prayer. Those of you who weren't in the Didache discussion, the Didache is a document from the 1st century, maybe even kinds of around the time of the Gospel of Mark or Matthew, that we believe contains the teachings of how the early church was to organize itself. So while it may have been written at a certain point in time, we believe the traditions predate that.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have an understanding that the Lord's Prayer is something that has become central to the followers of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have someone whose name is Hippolytus, who is a historian of the church, who writes in the 3rd century that prayers should be offered at the 3rd, 6th, 9th hours as well as midnight. Why did he pick the 3rd, 6th, and 9th?
Well, 3 is a special number, right? Those are all multiples of 3.
Sure. Yeah.
That's very early. I mean,
So we're talking about 9 o'clock, noon, and 3 o'clock.
Oh, it has to do with the Jesus dying on the cross, right?
Right. He's crucified at the 3rd hour. The 6th hour, we get a discussion of of what's happening, and then the 9th hour, he gives himself up. So, at the significant times of the crucifixion is when we should have our daily prayers, and then midnight. I think he just tacks in midnight because it's nice.
You're supposed to wake up at midnight and pray.
Correct. And at each of these times, it's appropriate to use the Lord's Prayer. Again, not the only prayer, but it's appropriate to have the Lord's Prayer as part of that prayer during that time. So how many times do we say the Lord's Prayer ourselves?
I say it every day, every night.
For me, it would be at worship once a week.
Once a week. Okay.
I say it whenever I feel like praying, which may be frequently or infrequently, but I use it a lot.
Every morning.
Every morning.
Yeah, every day.
I'm more like Nancy.
Every night before going to sleep.
You had a slightly different version ages ago, and that's the one I prefer. Just modern words.
Next time, or which version is it? I think we've used the one from New Zealand in our service before. Okay. Which is not really the Lord's Prayer, but that's okay. And when you look at it and when we talk about it, and I say that sort of like facetiously, but also there's a reason why the words that are used make up the Lord's Prayer. And so once we've studied that, then go and look, and does that prayer convey those messages? That's what I would say. Because I think in our desire to make it more modern and contemporary, we may have lost the meanings of the prayer in its original. So it's not don't use it, but sort of also reflect upon what the meaning was originally. And because I think the meaning is still true, but I can understand why some people prefer a slightly more modern version of it.
When was the New Zealand prayer? When did that materialize in worship?
I don't know when they started using it.
Well, in truth, when I use that, I have to read it. But when I'm not reading, then I go back to the original.
I actually
As a
memorized
Catholic or as a former Catholic, do you pray it in Latin?
I did it one time, but I don't remember that anymore.
Al does all the time, and he wasn't even Catholic.
Okay.
He's just an old soul. I don't see anything that says when it was written or where it originated. Well, let's see. Does this?
Is it the Anglican Church of New Zealand or?
Yes. So it looks like it's there's influence. No. Oh, too many ads.
Isn't there a whole thing about Maori?
Yes, the Maori tradition helps influence it. So the book that it comes from was published in 2008.
Yeah, it's pretty.
Oh.
Huh.
So let me see if I have that. Oh, let me share this. If you wonder how it may have appeared in the Aramaic, and this is thanks to Barb's, but so there's one major church that still works from what we might understand as Aramaic, and that's the Syriac Church. It's a very small denomination. Obviously, it's mostly the tradition is mostly found in the Middle East. The Maronites might use the Syriac liturgy. There is a Syriac church, but let me share with you their version of it. No, I just had it. What did I do with it? Oh, there it is. So it's Our Father who in heaven, let it be hallowed thy name. Let it come thy kingdom. Let it be done thy will, as in heaven, so on earth. Give us bread which is necessary today, and forgive us our debts and our trespasses, as we have forgiven our debtors. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen.
Covers both bases with debts and trespasses.
Correct.
Mm.
Wasn't there a couple years ago a big deal about Francis wanting to change the emphasis of delivering us from evil? There was something about and it's not the way that we say it, but you know what I'm talking about? Something about, what was that? Do you remember?
Well, I don't remember, but I do know that is something we're going to spend a lot of time on.
Okay.
Because there is an understanding of deliver us from evil, but also like the issue of temptation.
Oh, that's what it was.
Do not lead us into trial is originally.
Yeah, that's what it was. That's what it was.
We're going to talk about that because it is significant. And I think we've tried to lessen it. In other words, in this prayer, a lot of the onus is on us. And it's not on God.
Yeah.
And frequently we've tried to, in the more modern sense, put this all on God.
Mm.
And when we begin studying it and seeing how the earliest church understood it, what the church fathers understood it to be, and then compare it even to, might compare it to some of our different confessional standards of what it really means, as opposed to maybe how when we're just reciting it, verot, we sort of lose that. And so what does it mean when we say, hallowed be thy name?
Holy is your name. Your name is holy.
Yes, but it's actually everything that we do is holy. We We, not God, we. And so we're going to study all this, and it's going to be interesting. And hopefully it encourages us to have a slightly different, not only understanding on the prayer, but also a deeper understanding of what we're praying for in general. All right. So since I know Ginger has one eye on her TV screen and just one eye on her computer screen.
Well, on her phone.
Oh, she's got the ESPN Gamecast going.
I'm in no, I do not, and I'm embarrassed that you're bringing that up. So.
Well, I'm just using it as the excuse because everybody else is doing the same thing. I mean, Al did not want to be on this because Al is so into the Eagles.
Well, you know, Todd, I thought you were talking about the Iowa caucuses when you said, let me look at and see if there's anything that's come up.
Please, if you want to watch a dumpster fire, you can go and watch a dumpster fire.
Well, I was doing that before we came on, trying to check it out.
Oh, you might as well just watch the Eagles game. They're both kind of useless.
I appreciate the fact that you're aware of it.
Or pick up a good book. Or say the Lord's Prayer.
Right.
All right, so next week we're going to start with Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. We're going to deal with that. So I will have on Sunday, look for the catechism information and grab it, but I will also scan it and email it out if for case, you're sick or you're not able to make worship on Sunday. Otherwise, thank you for your time this evening. And Bible study, don't forget, we're on Zoom tomorrow at 10.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you for
Thank
your time,
you.
Todd.
All right, blessings, guys.
Thanks.
No
Bye.
problem.
Good night.
Thanks a lot. Take care.